Gene, what were we talking about just a second ago? And I was like, hold off. Save that for the podcast.
My boss is Chase Anderson, who is Bass's CEO. And Chase is a little bit of an old school kind of guy. Although he's not very old relative to me. I'm an old guy. Chase really likes the feel of what Bass was during the Ray Scott years. Kind of that nostalgia kind of thing. And the fact that Ray Scott, when he founded Bass back in, the late 60s, it was founded on not just fishing tournaments, but also getting youth involved in the program. And then, as Ray always called it, the three-legged stool. The third leg of that stool was conservation. Mm-hmm. And Chase really wants to try to emphasize that more in what we do. The public thinks of Bass as a tournament organization, and we're really so much more. And we do a lot more. We don't tell the story as well as we probably should.
Sure.
And for many years, the focus has been on tournaments, and certainly that's the focal point for most people. What I do as the conservation director, for the most part, is behind the scenes, and people don't see it. Yep. They don't know about it. So what we're trying to do, at least we've been working quite a bit more this year, is trying to just tell that story a little better. And JM Associates, our video team out of Little Rock, put together some really good videos. They played a bunch of them at the Classic.
Yep, they keep playing them.
Yeah. And they're playing them during the live stream. And a lot of that is to just get people more aware of what Bass is still involved with in terms of conservation, and drive people to the website where we have more information, things about the work that we do behind the scenes. And so that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is get that information out there more so that people can realize that there's more to Bass than just tournaments.
Sure.
Gene, you live in Oklahoma, right? You don't show up to Bass headquarters in Alabama and sit in a cubicle all day.
Right.
Well, explain your day-to-day as the conservation director at Bass.
Yeah, I live in Oklahoma. I live in Norman. I retired from the Oklahoma Wildlife Department after 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And I've been doing the conservation gig for Bass now for 10 years.
Wow.
I actually worked with Bass for 20 years prior, helping with fish care and
when the tournaments would come to Oklahoma,
all over the country.
Oh wow!
I've been to every Classic since 1993.
Wow!
And but as to your question of what my job involves, there's really three parts of it. One of them is the fish care part, which is kind of what most people think of when they think of what I do. When you guys see me at the tournaments, at the elite tournaments, but I go to some of the nation tournaments, some of the opens, some of the high school. I kind of mix and match where I think there's a need for some extra help.
Yep.
With the fish care side of things, and working with our tournament staff, making sure that we're doing everything right in terms of keeping the fish healthy. That's one facet of my job. Another part of it is Bass has a network of Bass Nation affiliates, the chapters all around the country. There's 47 states and one Canadian province. Each one of them has a state conservation director who is just a volunteer. It's just a bass fisherman that cares a little bit more about the resource. But most of them don't have any kind of knowledge or history of working with state agencies, working with policy, working with government, that sort of thing.
Fun stuff.
So I help them work on their state and local problems, kind of help mentor them through some of those issues. And sometimes Bass dives into those a little more deeply, try to put a little horsepower behind some of those issues.
Things like the fish must be hooked in the mouth when pertaining to salmon instead of bass, those types of issues.
Regulation issues, pollution issues.
Yeah.
sometimes it's just things sticking up for bass fishing, in the face of other threats. The third part of my job is something that probably the least fun is actually that policy thing. Bass has had a seat on a number of different national boards and councils that deal with fisheries policy at the national level, dealing with
lobbying
federal government. Well, I'm not actually a lobbyist. I'm not, but what we do is work with partners that have lobbyists. The American Sport Fishing Association, ASA. In fact, next week, Tuesday, we're flying to Washington, D.C. I've got a meeting where I'm going to be in D.C. for 4 days at an ASA Government Affairs Committee. And part of that, one of the days, we will be going to Capitol Hill, going from room to room, talking to some selected senators and representatives about legislation that is in Congress right now that affects the sport of fishing.
What can not to detour too much, but what are some of the major pieces that are up right now?
Most of these things that are going through Congress right now are things that will help fund, say, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or other federal agencies who are involved in fishery management. The one that's the most important to us from the bass fishing side is reauthorization of a bill that helps fund the National Fish Habitat Partnerships. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of an umbrella group that gives out big dollar grants to do habitat enhancement projects. And one of the partnerships gets about $200,000 a year to do reservoir fish habitat enhancement. And so we want Congress to say yes to reauthorizing that. The bill, a lot of times these bills have a length limit. They only last for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they have to come back to Congress, and Congress has to bless them again and get them reauthorized and get the money put back in the Treasury so that we can keep going. So that's one of the big ones that we're looking at.
Is there anything, because that's a positive, is there anything up right now that could hurt bass fishing?
Not at the federal level. Mm-hmm. The federal government doesn't manage bass fisheries per se. They can help provide money for things like this habitat work. Most of the really important legislation that affects bass fishing at the state level is managed by the state fish and wildlife agencies, not the federal government. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of been one of the challenges we've had, because the ASA as an organization is used to dealing with federal legislation. But unfortunately, from our side, we've got to deal with every state. And we've got, luckily, kind of back to having these partners. Besides ASA, there's another group called the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. And if you remember Chris Horton, who was in my job several years back, Chris works for the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. And they've got people in every state that kind of keep tabs on what legislation is being introduced in each of those states. So we've got kind of people out there that are watchdogs. And when they find something that potentially affects bass fishing, good or bad, that's when, as a group, we get all of our partners together and start putting the horsepower behind it to, write your congressman, that kind of thing.
Does Bassmaster help fund those groups?
Some. For the most part, they are funded by some really big donors. Bass doesn't put a whole lot of money into that, but we certainly help provide a lot of media support, because, in the grand scheme of things, Bass is a media company. And with the fact that we have 500,000 members and we have such a big audience with Bassmaster.com and the magazine, that when things come up where there are those write your congressman kind of moments, that's when we can jump on those things through our social media or through the magazine or the website and send out those calls to action to get people fired up and behind these causes, whatever it is. So we let some of those other partners like ASA and CSF who have registered lobbyists, they're the ones that are going to the senators, Capitol Hill. They're helping write the legislation, or they're keeping tabs on what's going on. And then they raise the flag, and then we rally the troops to try to help, either for or against whatever the legislation happens to be.
Gene, in your opinion, out of all 50 states in our awesome country, which state is the most bass fishing friendly? Who funds the sport of bass fishing? And the second part to that question is, why is Texas the best?
That's right.
It's a matter of scale.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Texas. I'm from Texas.
Yeah.
I've lived in Oklahoma a lot longer, but I went to Texas A&M. I'm sorry.
Yikes! Out.
She's SMU. Yeah.
But it's Texas has a tremendous amount of resources, just natural resources. They got a lot of lakes, and then they got a lot of people that buy fishing licenses.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dollars invested in it, and certainly they are very bass fishing friendly. There are some other states, though, that I think are just as bass fishing friendly, but maybe on a smaller scale. I would say Arkansas is one of those.
Okay.
Arkansas has some really good programs directed towards bass fishing. They've got a black bass biologist team. They do a lot for tournaments. They do probably more for tournament fishing than any state in the country, in terms of building facilities and weigh-in facilities and boat ramps and providing.
Why don't we go there more?
Why doesn't bass go anywhere?
Yeah.
Some of it is finding facilities, lodging, and a host who is willing to pay the fees to bring the circus to town.
And that's Eric Lopez's job. That's not your department, right?
Right.
I know, but to hear that a state puts that much into to take
Ramps,
off areas and
facilities,
supporting the sport of bass fishing, like even if they didn't, in my opinion, I know this isn't you, like we should be supporting them.
I think one of the things that Eric and his team are trying to do more of is work with the state tourism agencies.
Sure.
Because a lot of the smaller communities, they may not have the money, the resources, the facilities and things to bring a tournament to town. But if you can partner with your state tourism agency, then maybe there's a little better chance of
budget,
of having the funds.
Sure.
And I know Eric and his team are constantly looking for places to go. And they're always, we always get the people said, "Wow, man, the fishing in my lake is great. Why don't you bring a tournament?" Well,
yeah, you see that comment a lot.
You gotta have the boat ramps and the parking. You gotta have hotels you gotta have enough places to put people. So there's a whole package of things that has to come together, and it does take some dollars, and that's why I say I always kind of kid about bringing the circus to town, but it's a pretty expensive proposition to haul the people and the equipment and everything that's involved in putting on one of our tournaments to wherever you want to send it.
Right. How, kind of want to just jump into some stuff. How much do you think you guys spend when it comes to an elite event, and you might not be able to say this number, on keeping the fish alive during the weigh-in portion?
On my component of an elite tournament, I don't know. We dedicate 2 live release boats to every tournament and an operator. How much we pay those guys, I don't, I don't know the budget end of it, but I can tell you that every one of our tournaments, we dedicate at least 2 release boats, sometimes 3, depending on where it is. If we think the catch is going to be really big, we will have a 3rd release boat. So that's a manpower issue. If it's a place where it's going to be really hot and we're going to need lots of extra help, that's typically the ones that I show up at. But if you think about high school, college, Bass Nation, Opens, and Elites, we pretty much run the same format as far as the weigh-in process that we have, the release boats and everything. The only difference is the stage.
Yeah.
And the Jumbotron. It doesn't go everywhere. But the big stage really doesn't go to each one of those. But we set up the same set of tanks. We set up the same release boats. We've got a system that we use at all of those different levels, whether it's a 100-boat elite tournament or a 250-boat college tournament. And so, as far as dedicating resources, that's what we put into each one of those. Now, dollars and cents wise, I haven't got a clue. That's way above. That's way above my pay grade.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Like most viewers don't have the privilege to see what goes on behind that stage. They just tune into Bassmaster.com. They watch Corey Johnson weigh in 27 pounds, 23 pounds, blah blah blah. But behind the stage, there, I mean, you and your team are working your tails off. You have a dozen bump tanks, which are huge horse troughs. You got to fill those each and every day, clean those each and every day.
Right.
You're pumping oxygen full. You're loading it full of ice.
I want to hear his process straight from him.
Well, I'm just telling you what I see. I mean, you guys are zipping all around. You've got an O2 meter. You've got temperature gauges. In some of these summer tournaments, I mean, you're going around literally with a bottle of oxygen, pumping some of these things, full of oxygen. Who buys the ice? Do you buy the ice every morning at the gas station?
No. That's typically part of the negotiation with the host community.
Provide the ice.
People, I was kidding with somebody the other day as I was carrying a bunch of bags of ice around. They said, well, what is the National Conservation Director for Bass do? And I said, I haul ice.
How many pounds do you go through normally during an elite 4-day event?
Dude, they've got wheelbarrows.
2,000 or 3,000 pounds.
Yeah.
Wow.
We did a college, it was high school, a high school tournament at Kentucky Lake several summers ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I calculated that I carried 7,000 pounds of ice over the course of 3 days.
Wow.
It was so hot, that, and to your point, what we try to do is set up an environment backstage so that when Chris bags his fish and brings them up there, our backstage tanks are kind of like a first aid station.
Mm.
The water's cooled a little bit. We don't drop it too much. It's usually 5 to 7 degrees or so below what the lake is.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Not to cut you off, but where do y'all take the temperature in the lake? What part is there a certain part of the lake you go to, or?
We will, generally what I'll try to do is contact some of the guys that are in camera boats that are out in different parts of the lake.
Smart.
First thing in the morning, because that's when the water is generally the coolest. I don't care about what the water temperature is at 4:00 in the afternoon. That surface temperature is so hot anyway.
Sure.
I want to know what it is early in the morning, because that's going to tell me a little bit more about what it's like.
Baseline.
Right. That's kind of my target.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we go try to knock it down 5 to 7 degrees below that. We do the same thing in the release boats. And we don't want to drop that temperature so much that it shocks the fish, but it makes the environment a little bit cooler for them, a little more comfortable. We put a little salt in the water, because just like your blood, a fish's blood is saline. And so you put a little bit of salt in the water, and that kind of helps them start in that recuperating process, because they've been stressed all day from being caught and put in Livewell and, bounced around, whatever. So the waiting line tanks are really kind of like, I say, a first aid station. We've got 2 big compressors that pump air through them. So we're maintaining oxygen and temperature in those tanks. The fish come up, they go through the tanks. You get up on stage, Lisa weighs the fish, you hold up a couple, they go right back into the mesh bags, and then that bag is carried right back to the release boats, where we've, again, iced them down, cooled the water a little bit. And on the release boats, we're using pure oxygen. So it's really like
juiced up,
like an intensive care kind of a situation, because in the waiting lines tanks backstage, those fish aren't in there that long before you work your way through and come out. Sometimes in the release boat, the fish might be in there for an hour before the boat gets filled up with fish, and we're ready to start filling the second boat. But that's another thing that we try to do. Our scales on stage are connected to a computer backstage.
Mm-hmm.
So I know how many pounds of fish have been weighed.
Oh, wow.
How many are in that boat?
And we know exactly how many pounds have gone into the boat. And we have a capacity that's 600 pounds. It's a pound per gallon, 600-gallon tanks. When that boat reaches 600 pounds, we start loading the second boat.
Is it 600 pounds for largemouth and smallmouth?
Yes.
Does it matter?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, for smallmouth, we will dial the oxygen up a little bit, because smallmouth tend to use more oxygen for the same size fish than a largemouth does. Then they're a little bit more sensitive to that. So that's one of the things that when we do go up north, we have to be a little bit more conscientious about watching the temperature and watching the oxygen. And that's where, when we're up in some of the smallmouth tournaments, I'll carry a little oxygen bottle around with me.
Yeah.
With an air stone.
Yeah.
And I'm watching, and I've got a meter, and I'm watching the oxygen levels in our tanks. And if they start to drop a little bit, I can drop that air stone in and turn the gas on and give them a little shot of oxygen to maintain that. Once they get in the release boats, they're good to go. But we use that same system in all of our tournaments, whether it's a high school or the elites. And we have at least 2 or 3 times in the last 20 years had state agencies take fish after one of our tournaments and hold those fish and look at survival of those fish.
Nice.
Interesting.
To see. And it's always been really, really good. And so we've got a proven system.
Yeah.
What states have taken them in the past?
Texas did some a long time ago. Alabama's done some. We did some with, I want to say it was South Carolina a few years back.
Any of the more left states, like towards up north, a little more, that might be more hostile to tournament fishing?
No. We haven't had any,
like New York or anything?
They haven't done any of the worked with, at least in recent years, worked with us on any kind of delayed mortality kind of stuff.
The system you just talked about, how close to perfect is it in your opinion?
Did any of those fish die that the states took?
Yes. We can dive into that whole issue. The only thing that I would change right now is when we do go up north, I would like to have us running bottled oxygen in the tanks backstage
instead of just
air, right? Because the air, we've got just big compressors that just pump air,
right? And
air is only 20% oxygen, and so in smallmouth tournaments, when you guys are really catching the crap out of them, and there's 3 or 4 bags of smallmouth in that tank, they're using oxygen pretty fast, and that's when running pure oxygen in those tanks would probably be better.
Why don't you do that?
Right now it's just a cost thing. And I have been able to, with my little portable bottle, been able to keep up. And we've only had in the 10 years that I've been doing it now, in the tournaments that I've gone to up north, we've only had one tournament where the oxygen levels in our tanks got low enough that I was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
St. Lawrence?
Yes. One of the turn, I don't remember if it was in Clayton or Waddington, one of the places up there. But since I had my little portable bottle and my air stone, I was able to, kind of get us over the hump.
Yeah.
And we didn't have any, we weren't having fish dying or anything like that. So,
was this system in place prior to you arriving, or did you make some tweaks to this whole?
It has
process?
been an evolution.
Sure. Since Ray Scott said, "Hey, we need to take care of these things."
The first, when catch and release tournaments started back in the 70s, they didn't know what to do. They didn't, it was a new thing.
Tanks, like what are they?
It was a whole new thing, and so nobody really knew what to do. And so they kind of felt their way along, I guess, a little bit at a time.
Right.
Doug Hannon was one of the first people to come along, and he worked with bass back in probably the 80s, I guess, on icing the tanks. And that was kind of the first part of the process. Mm-hmm. And since then, it's just been an evolution. When the people that were in my position, Bruce Shupp, who was one of the first conservation directors, and then Chris Horton did it for a while. Each one of us has kind of tweaked things a little bit. There was a time when all the fish came up in solid vinyl bags, and you had a little air stone that you dropped down into the bag. Well, we found out that if the oxygen in that water in the bag starts to be depleted, that little air stone won't raise it fast enough. So that's when we said, okay, let's just aerate the whole tank and use the mesh bags.
There you go. Yeah.
So it's little things like that
Sure.
that over the years we have said, okay, let's find a better way to make this work.
Yeah, this isn't a Tuesday night get-together tournament. Yeah.
But the thing about that, though, is, and this is one of the things that I really, really want to do, is I want to get some video stuff put together for our website that explains how you can take this whole system that we've got behind the stage at an elite tournament and use it at a Tuesday night jackpot.
Yeah.
There's parts and pieces of that they can use. Now, they're not going to have release boats, and they don't have 12 tanks and stuff like that. But just something simple as the mesh bags is something that can really help. And one of the things that we've tried to do is try to recommend things that I call a fish-friendly weigh-in, and tweak the Wednesday night or whatever it is kind of tournament that you're running.
So mesh over. So I've fished several different tournaments, and there's a lot of like plastic bags that you put water in. So that's not a good situation.
If you're fast, they're okay. But what we found was, if you put a few gallons of water in that bag and put fish in it, they will use the oxygen up in that water in less than 2 minutes.
Wow.
So if you've got people waiting in line,
oh yeah,
and sitting there, and how many times have you seen a guy with his bag and it's sitting on the hot asphalt?
Oh my gosh, that's the worst. Yeah.
So that's why we've said we want to speed people through the weigh-in. We want to keep the number of bags that we hand out to a minimum. That's why we got 50 guys out there. We don't want to get out 50 bags because we don't want people waiting and waiting. We want to be able to get them up in the tanks. That's why we have flights too, so it kind of spaces it out. So yeah, the plastic bags. I mean, if you've got a 10-boat tournament and you can get them out of your boat, put them in the bag, get them over here, get them on the scales, and get them released in a minute, you're probably okay. But that generally doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so that's where, that's why I say there's part about our system that I think would be pretty easy. The other thing that we really try to do is keep fish in the water as much as possible. And I've had a stopwatch several times. From the time, let's say, Chris pulls up to the dock, and he takes his fish out of the live well and he holds them. There's a photographer there and they're taking pictures, and you put them in your bag, which has got water in it. Then you bring them up to the bump sink where they dump them out. And now you've got your mesh bag with the fish in it. You carry it over to the sink or the waiting line tanks. And you go from tank to tank to tank until you get up to where Alan or whoever's bumping the fish, they dump them out in the sink, and he checks to make sure they're live or dead and legal length and all of that. They go back in your mesh bag, and you go back through some more tanks. And then at some point you go up on stage. They weigh the fish. You hold up a couple for pictures, back in the bag, and a fish runner, sometimes little kids, or volunteers that we have backstage, run them down to the release boat. Several times during that process, those fish are in air, and fish don't breathe air.
Yeah.
Okay. They got to be in water. So I've timed that. And if you add up all those little pieces of where the fish are out of water, it's always less than a minute. It's 10 seconds here, 5 seconds there. Up on stage is probably the longest period,
right?
But it might be 20 seconds, 30 seconds.
Right.
But then they're getting back in water. So we're trying to speed that process up, keep the fish wet, get them back into the tank. And it's been a pretty successful process. And we have, for long as I can remember, talked about the release rate of how many fish we turn loose at the end of our tournaments out of our release boats. And we have been 95% plus for 20 years.
Wow.
But the catch is that's how many fish are released, not necessarily how many survive.
Right.
A week or two
Delayed
or three.
mortality.
Right. And delayed mortality is the thing that fishermen just have such a hard time understanding, because I don't know how many times I've heard guys say, I ain't never weighed in a dead bass. I got the best Livewell.
Right.
I use this concoction and put in there, and I've never had a bass die. Well, he doesn't know what happens to those fish 3 or 4 days later. And when they float up around the marina or the boat dock or somewhere, that's given us a black eye.
Yeah.
But he's gone. The tournament's gone. They've packed up. They've gone home. They don't always see those fish that are dead.
How many times since you've been with Bass in 10 years have y'all had a situation where you've gotten a phone call 4 days, 5 days a week, however long, and said...
And not just elites, some of these high school tournaments that I always hear about.
I want to start with elites, and then you can throw those in. But on the elites, would you say that you've got a call from a community that's like, what did y'all do?
One time.
Can you say where that was?
Waddington.
Yeah, that first year.
That one that...
First year, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the one that we're struggling with oxygen levels too?
Well, guys weren't fizzing their fish.
Yeah. 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 It's, and it was it's, having worked with a state agency and done fish kill investigations and stuff, I know that people see a few dead fish, and by the time we get the call, the numbers have multiplied, many times, 10 fish turn into 1,000. But, as a state agency, when I was working as a biologist, we got those calls. I mean, I worked a tournament. The worst one I've ever seen was on Grand Lake. There was an organization that had a tournament in July. They had a release boat. They had a pretty decent weigh-in system, but they wound up stacking all the fish in the release boat. And the guys caught them. I mean, it was a 20-pound bag after 20-pound bag coming in, and there was probably more fish than water in the release boat. I mean, it was, and they went out and they turned these fish loose, and they started floating up almost immediately. And it was operator error. The guy that's running the release boat just screwed up.
Yeah.
And there were 600 dead bass.
That's a lot.
Floating around.
Big
the
ones
next
too.
day.
4s and 5s. Yeah.
CNN sent a helicopter.
Uh-oh.
There was aerial photos of these fish. Looked like popcorn floating around.
Wow.
I got a call from the governor's office the next day. They wanted to shut tournaments down.
In the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah. Well, GRDA and Grand Lake. And we calmed everybody down. We said, hey, this we can fix this.
What year was this?
Oh, gosh.
Back when Grand was good.
mid-90s, maybe. And it was a real wake-up call
for everyone.
A lot of the tournament organizations realized, wow, we better start doing things better, or somebody's going to tell us we can't do it at all.
Right.
And that, in a lot of respects, the numbers of fish that die from any individual tournament is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the fish in any given lake. But when you have something like that happen, it becomes a social problem,
like a PR stain.
Exactly, more than a biological problem, and that's when the knee-jerk reaction by whether it's the state or the local community or whoever owns the lake is, oh, well, we got to shut this down. And that's a big reason why. I mean, I've been fishing tournaments since I was in junior high, and I'm an old guy. So I have always had this idea that if we can educate people on how to do it better, then the government doesn't have to tell us how to run things. And so the better job we do, whether it's at Bass or whether it's at the Wednesday night jackpot, the better off we're going to be. Not only are we going to be able to do have the tournaments we want to have, but it's good for the resource.
Sure.
We're not going to be having any real impact on the resource. But that whole delayed mortality thing is just something that the bass fishermen just have a hard time wrapping their heads around.
So when going back to, you said you've had some states take bass from the tournaments and take them back and study, I would assume, the delayed mortality from your events. How has that went?
It's very, 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 very temperature dependent. The survival of fish after they're released after tournaments is almost directly related to water temperature. The hotter it is, the more fish are likely to die 2, 3, 4, 5 days later. We had, I think it was in Alabama, we had, after one of the classics, the fish were from Guntersville. Alabama DNR took all of the fish back to one of their hatcheries, and they fin clipped them. They were doing genetic studies like that.
What do you mean, all of the fish? Every fish that was caught
all the fish that were caught at the classic.
Do you
that
remember
year.
How many that was?
I don't remember numbers, but for 3 days, all the fish that were caught at Guntersville came from Guntersville to Birmingham, were weighed in, and then the state took those fish back to a hatchery that's fairly close by and kept those fish for a couple of days, did their genetic test. They took 99% of them back to the lake. So, we lost a handful of fish in that process. And that's...
So 1% did not make... There was a 1% delayed mortality.
Something like that, yeah.
What time of year was that, March?
Right. And that's the key. If that same tournament had been in August, it certainly would have been much, much higher.
What about Ray Roberts when y'all had to move it to the summer?
That was a little different animal. Between us and Texas Parks and Wildlife, us being Bass staff and Texas Parks and Wildlife, we went through a lot of extra steps at Ray Roberts because we knew it was going to be hot. When the boats came out of the water at the lake, we knew we had an hour some odd drive into Fort Worth. So we had people at the lake putting ice in the live wells to cool the water down. When they got to the arena in Fort Worth, we had people putting more ice and bottles, little oxygen bottles in each boat with air stones.
How when y'all put ice in water, how quick like say you put ice in your live well, how quick does it warm up to a bad temperature? Do you know?
Warm up or cool down?
Cool down.
Well, no, I'm talking about
how long does it last?
Lasts.
It varies depending on the size of the live well. like in my boat, I can put about 8 pounds of ice in my live well, like a bag, 10-pound bag of ice. And that'll keep the temperature about where I want it for about 2.5 to 3 hours. And at that point, I need to add some more because it's starting to creep up. And we don't want the temperature doing this. We'd rather it stay fairly consistent. One of the things I always recommend people do is get you a little swimming pool thermometer, one of the little floating,
little ducky,
like little duckies, and put one of those in your live well, and you can keep tracking. And a lot of the sonar units, like I've got a sensor on that actually reads on my console unit, so I can tell what the temperature is in my live well, and so I know when it's time to add more.
Did you wire that yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
that would be a
couple guys doing that.
Yeah. It's just a
bass boat companies just to do.
It's I think some of them have that maybe as an option now. Some of the high end boats that potentially have a sensor in there that can do that. So it's pretty easy to. But the whole deal with delayed mortality and kind of turning this around the other side of this is. What we do as a tournament organization and the first aid station that we set up in our weigh-ins can only do so much.
Right.
The angler has those fish in their live wells for 4, 5, 6, 8 hours.
Sure.
That's where the key is. It's not, we jump through a lot of hoops and do a lot of things on our end, but they've got to do their job in the boat.
If the damage is done before y'all get them, it doesn't matter.
The stresses from being caught, held in the live well, bounced around in rough water, all of those stresses are cumulative. They add up. Mm-hmm. And it's worse and worse and worse in hot water, the warmer the water is. And at some point, it may not kill the fish right away. It just screws up their internal systems enough that they die a few days later. Mm-hmm. And you don't know it. Mm-hmm. That's one of the crazy things about this whole delayed mortality is you turn the fish loose and they swim off. You think, okay, I've done my job. But you don't know what happens to that fish a few days later. So that's why it's so important for the anglers to do what they need to do in their live wells. And that's what the stuff that's on our Bassmaster website right now, it's called Keeping Bass Alive. That's the short term for it.
I haven't seen it. Yeah, I got to check that out.
And it is a process of here's what you need to be doing in your live well, how to operate your aerators, how to add ice. And it's, again, it goes back to that whole temperature thing. If the water temperatures are 45 or 50 or 55, 60 degrees, it's pretty easy to keep them alive. Bass are pretty tough critters.
They are, especially river bass.
It's when you get up there into the 70s and 75 and 80, and then, some places it's 85 or more. That's when you've really got to start paying attention and do more.
There's a lot of like tips and tricks of how to keep bass alive in these live wells. You're seeing the foam floaties at the top. You recommend that or no?
Yeah.
Yep. Recommend that. Okay. Live well treatment like Rejuvenate or Please Release Me or G-Juice.
We don't recommend any of the commercial products because the ingredients in them have not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration for fish that are going to be released and might be caught again and eaten by somebody.
Oh.
It doesn't mean that they're bad, but they haven't gotten that good housekeeping, the FDA seal of approval. And so there's none of the state agencies that recommend any of those things too.
Lastly, the Mountain Dew trick.
Pause on that.
Wait, what?
Because this is driving me nuts. I've been trying to get your attention. What did you do? That's why that's the aesthetic of our podcast. He had it on the ground, Charles. This whole time I'm watching his whole thing glowing green. You had him looking like a Ninja Turtle. Sorry.
Speaking of the green light there, so the Mountain Dew trick. So lastly, the Mountain Dew trick. What I mean, I mean, it works, right? So it stops the bleeding. I mean, if for those of you who don't know, like if you catch a fish, it's hooked in the gills or in the tongue or whatever, and it's spewing blood out. I mean, it's old trick. You dump Mountain Dew.
It's the citric acid.
Well, there's a lot of debate whether it's citric acid or whether it's the
dye,
whether it's the carbon dioxide.
Okay.
There's a professor in Canada did a study. They used northern pike instead of bass, but still they'd cut a gill and they'd pour this and this and this and this, and they tried them all. And they said the best thing you can do is put them back in cool water. And there again, yes, the Mountain Dew may stop the bleeding, but we don't know what it does
afterwards.
Later. Yeah. A lot of those drinks are pretty acidic. And if you think about the gill filaments, they're pretty delicate.
Yeah, very much.
And maybe that's not the best thing to be pouring down the fish's throat.
Right.
If it gets on their gills. So, their study said you're better off just putting them back in the water. And for the most part,
as a tournament fisherman, selfishly, and this is most guys, right? Just keep them alive for another 5 hours till I get to the weigh-in, and then I don't care after that, right? Like, how many guys think that? I mean, that's,
a lot.
That's everyone.
A lot. And unfortunately, that's again, it goes back to that whole thing of that delayed mortality is kind of invisible.
Yeah.
People don't see it. They don't understand that it even happens. And so they don't think they need to do some of that extra stuff. And that's one of the things we've battled with for, when Dr. Hal Schramm and I wrote the original Keeping Bass Alive booklet in 2003. And the recommendations that we made then are the same ones we have now. We haven't really changed that.
So it's straightforward,
because it works.
Yeah.
And it's been tested several times. And it's just getting people to follow some of those guidelines, like using ice. We've got some people that have gone kind of overboard and put too much ice in their live wells because, it slows the fish down and you'll get them back to weigh-in alive. The problem is if you cool your live well down to like 50 degrees and then we take them out of that 50-degree water and put them in our tanks where it's 75 degrees, bass can handle going from warm to cold, but they can't go from cold to hot.
Big shock.
That screws up something in their systems.
Interesting.
And it will kill them a few days later. So that's why we say let's only go down, less than 10 degrees. 5 to 7 degrees is a good range for cooling your live well. But that's enough to give them that first aid, so that they're good. And then running the aerators all the time, keeping the oxygen levels up, using the chemicals. That's kind of a personal thing.
Yeah.
There was one of them that's no longer on the market. Oh, it was so good. It was the best stuff. It had an antibiotic in it. It had a sedative that calmed the fish down. They'd get real tranquil.
What was it called?
Oh, no, I can't say.
Oh, man.
But it was so good. And then they found that the sedative causes cancer.
Oh, wow.
Dang.
In humans or bass?
In the bass?
In people.
In people.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that thing where if you
Down
release
the
that
road.
fish and somebody catches it later, some kid catches it off the bank and they take it home and eat it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting.
But it was, in fact, some of the state agencies used it for a long time in hatcheries because it was so good about calming the fish down, which is what you want to do in your live well.
But you just salt, right? That's
What we recommend and what's approved by the FDA is ice, oxygen, and salt. And
straight up table salt.
Table salt, but you want the non-iodized kind.
Okay.
Kind of doesn't have iodine in it. And in your live well, the only time you really need to add salt is when you're recirculating. If you're pumping fresh water, it just flushes it right out.
Right.
That ain't any good.
Right.
You put a cup to 5 gallons. So you figure out how many gallons your live well holds. Like I carry mine in
Full cup.
I carry mine in little Ziploc bags already pre-measured, so I know how much I can just dump in.
So what's better though, recirculating with salt or pumping fresh water in?
Depends on the temperature. See, that's where if you get into our keeping bass alive guidelines, when you hit a certain point, pumping fresh water is fine. Just keep pumping fresh water. You keep your temperature good and your oxygen's fine. At some point, though, the temperature starts getting so high that most boats' aerator systems can't hardly keep up. So that's when you start recirculating. Put a little ice in there, cools the water down. Cooler water holds more oxygen.
Right.
Kind of calms your fish down a little bit. Then you recirculate. Or if you've got a long run, like if you're running for an hour and a half or somewhere like that, and you're going to be recirculating, that's when you're going to be able to put salt in there. If you're pumping fresh water, it's just going to flush it right out. But when the water temperatures get into the mid 70s and higher, that's when we want to start thinking about recirculating and adding the ice and the salt. And the newest addition to our recommendations is actually oxygen injection systems with bottled oxygen. And Todd Driscoll's the one, Todd from Texas Parks and Wildlife was the one that did a lot of research on this in Texas, looking at if you've got really big bag of bass, if you've got 25 or 30 pounds of fish, the way boat live wells are built now, the fish are going to use oxygen faster than the aerator systems can put it back. And the only way to keep those fish healthy is with
pure
oxygen,
O2.
Pure oxygen.
So
and some system. I mean, there's, a bottled oxygen, a bottle with a regulator and a air stone. And now there's 2 or 3 other devices out there on the market that you can buy and, build into your boat. But basically it's an oxygen.
We were just talking about this last week. I was recovering from sickness after the Classic. I was doing traveling. And Trait ordered me some these Boost oxygen bottles. Have you seen those? They're for humans. It's like 99% oxygen in a can. It's like super light, and you could take hits off of it of pure oxygen. So it's marketed that way.
I don't think it's pure oxygen, but it's like some form.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, why don't we just take those little Boost oxygen things and just hold it under the water and let her rip?
It would probably do the same thing. It's probably a lot not really cost effective.
Right.
I mean, you can the system that Todd recommends, and it's on Texas Parks and Wildlife's website. They've got a whole system. He talks about buying the components. We actually tested one back in 1998. I've got one in my boat, and the oxygen bottle's about the size of a fire extinguisher. It's about this tall and about that big around, and it's got a little regulator. And then I've got a really good air stone in the bottom of the boat, or the live well, that puts out little bitty, teeny tiny bubbles. And that little bottle of oxygen will last all weekend. And you get it, you go to the welding shop and get it refilled for practically nothing. It hadn't really caught on much. I mean, they use them a lot on the coast. People use oxygen system for keeping bait alive.
Yes.
Among bass fishermen, there's some guys in Texas that have kind of adopted, and there's a handful of guys up in the smallmouth country, in the Great Lakes, that are starting to put oxygen systems in their boats because they're realizing that smallmouth are more sensitive, and so it's slow, but it doesn't cost a lot more. I think the system that Todd's got on the Parks and Wildlife website and the one that I've got in my boat, probably less than $300.
Is it safe for an oxygen can to get bounced around?
Yeah.
And it won't?
They have to be secured. They have to be strapped in. I mean, just like a fire extinguisher, you got a little clamp or something holds it in there. And that's one of the things a lot of people concerned about, fire hazards. Well, oxygen doesn't burn by itself. As long as you maintain your hoses and like that, it's not a problem. It's safe. But it's it all goes back to the angler having to be more conscientious. And in hot weather, extreme conditions, big bags of fish, that's when you got to do more.
Sure.
Yeah.
To keep those fish healthy.
So PR wise, when you were talking about all those fish getting knocked around and stressed in live wells and hot and all that, my brain immediately went to, we are going to get some comments that say, okay, so then why not, just catch and
weigh,
release? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Y'all, why are you even doing this?
Well, because Gene would be out of a job then.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, a catch, weigh, and release, or a catch, photo, and release, like the kayak tournaments use, certainly is better for the individual fish.
Right.
But when we look at managing bass fisheries, bass populations, the numbers of fish that die as a result of tournaments are not really impacting the overall bass population. There's a really interesting article on Bassmaster.com that was written by, they quoted the fish chief from Arkansas, and he talked about the numbers of bass that die are what he called decimal dust. It's like 0.000% of the numbers of bass in a lake that die because of bass tournaments. Nobody has ever shown in any of the studies in the last 50 years, or however long bass tournaments have been around, that tournaments are having any kind of long-term impact on bass populations.
Right. It's a pressure thing, right? The fish just aren't biting their lures versus the fish are dead.
Right. I don't think there's any doubt that with the increased number of tournaments and events we have, especially with the high schools and stuff like that, fish are changing behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
But they're still there. And the only evidence that we've got of any kind of negative impacts is that in some situations where you've got maybe smaller lakes that have a lot of tournament pressure and people are doing a lot of things wrong, that we may be kind of cropping off some of the larger fish. And I always try to explain this to people. I think of the fish population like a pyramid, that there's a lot of fish down at the bottom of the pyramid, and as you go up towards the top, there's fewer and fewer big ones. Well, tournaments don't fish for the little guys down here. They want to catch these big ones up here. And so if a certain percentage of them die because of tournaments, maybe we're just kind of doing that to the pyramid.
Chopping the top off a little bit.
Kind of flattening it off a little bit. And it takes a little bit longer for those fish to replace.
Yep.
A 5-pounder or a 10-pounder or whatever. They don't grow up overnight. In a very productive lake, you're not going to hurt it. Now, if you've got a lake that's more infertile, maybe less productive, the recruitment of bass is poor, it may take longer for those fish to be replaced.
In a state, how many of those infertile lakes are there? Are there a lot more than fertile lakes?
It's all over the map. Yeah. I mean, depending on where you are in the country and what, every lake's going to be a little bit different in terms of how productive it is and how well it can replenish itself. But when we manage bass fisheries, we don't manage it one fish at a time. We look at the whole population, and that's where some of the studies, like the one that Todd did at Sam Rayburn, and how many gazillion tournaments do they have at Rayburn?
Yeah, lots.
And what they looked at was, well, there's bass that die from natural causes, just illness, disease, old age, whatever. There's a certain percentage that are going to die every year, no matter what we do. There's still a few people that keep fish and take them home and eat them.
Right.
And so there's going to be some harvest of bass, and that's perfectly legal, depending on what the length limits are. There are a certain percentage of fish that even if you catch and release right away, that maybe they get hooked funny or something, and some of those fish are going to die. It's a little percentage. And then there's potential from tournaments. Well, if you think back, this is where being an old guy, I remember this. When I started fishing tournaments, we filleted them all and had fish fries afterwards.
Sure.
I grew up eating fried bass.
Yeah. Okay. We don't have that kind of harvest anymore. People don't keep bass. The catch and release ethic has gotten so strong that all over the country, with very few exceptions,
We can afford to,
the biologists are saying that the harvest of bass is like 5%.
and we actually probably need it up, right?
Well, in some
Some
places,
cases, yeah.
in some places, mortality being higher wouldn't be a bad thing.
So I have a theory, okay? And we haven't been down to Amstead or Falcon in a long time. But I always thought, and I could be wrong, but the bigger fish were always on the Mexico side, and they harvest on that side like none other. And so I was always
Come on, fish swim from the U.S. side to Mexico.
No,
all
they
the
get
time,
bigger
and
over
vice
there
versa.
because they harvest more. That's what I always thought.
Habitat is
No,
the reason.
harvest.
Habitat.
Less quantity, bigger fish.
Okay.
Well, the whole concept of slot length limits was based on the idea of thinning out the overabundant, hungry mouths at the bottom of that pyramid. Keep a bunch of those little fish. That leaves more food for the rest of them, and so they grow faster, and you get more big fish. The problem now is that so few people keep bass that in a lot of places, slot limits are pretty worthless.
Yeah.
For the most part, slot limits, and everybody says, well, let's put a slot limit on mine, and it'll fix everything. No, it won't. Not unless you start keeping bass. And everywhere that that states have changed regulations trying to make things more liberal, people still aren't keeping them.
Yeah.
Right.
So the problem we've got with, tournament mortality doesn't directly replace the harvest because, I said a minute ago, we don't fish for the little ones. If we had tournaments where you get prizes for the 5 littlest fish, that would be different. But you tend to, the ones that we tend to keep are the more quality size fish. And there's a little bit of evidence that the bigger they are, the more easily stressed they are, and potentially more of them will die.
Sure.
But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the entire bass population, we're not having any real significant impacts on the fish population. So back to your question, catch and release tournaments, Bass Pro Tour style, certainly for individual fish, that's a better outcome. The chances of those fish surviving are better.
Right.
The tournaments that we have and 99% of other tournaments that have a more traditional weigh-in have not been shown to be having big impacts on the bass populations. So back to what I said earlier, it's kind of a social problem.
Right.
So, the campaign that I've been on, preaching the gospel of better fish care, is more directed at getting people to do it right so that the naysayers don't come down on us, or that the government doesn't come down on us to say how we have to do our sport.
Right. It's not necessarily because we're affecting these fisheries. It's just more of a look.
Right.
So before we wind this down, I want to ask some specific questions. So let's just say since the split, because it's easy, right? 5 years. What's the worst tournament that loss wise we've had in the last 5 years?
He already answered that, didn't he?
No.
Well, actually, the worst one what you're thinking about is that elite tournament. We got complaints, but we didn't really lose that many fish. We had an open up there though a couple of years ago that was probably the worst. And I think again, we're running into situations where you've got people from all over the country, and they hit a situation where the water's maybe a little warmer than normal, so the fish are already stressed. You got folks that...
Is that like a July event or something?
Yeah, and they don't know what they need to be doing. And, especially like in the opens, and we see this a lot in the high school tournaments. You got folks that maybe they've never dealt with those situations. We see it at high school tournaments where we got kids coming from, especially the national championship. We got people coming from all over the country. And those are generally in July, August. Some of those kids have never seen 85-degree water, and they don't know what to do. And their boat captain doesn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so that's where the whole education thing's got to come in. We've got to reach those folks. And
that's the big complaint. I'm sure Randy Blockett will see this. He's going to say, we need to stop doing tournaments in the summers. What's your response to that?
We had after some of those fiascos we had in Oklahoma, we had a lot of organizations that decided not to fish summer tournaments. They would squeeze their season into they'd be done by June.
Mm-hmm.
Or they would split and have some in the fall, maybe a championship in the fall, and they would pretty much avoid like July and August,
mm-hmm.
the worst times of the year. And I can't say that that's not a good idea. I think that you get rid of those worst case situations, and you're going to be better off. However, I think there are things you can do in the summertime if you want to continue having tournaments in those hotter conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Is have 3 fish limit instead of 5. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 40% fewer fish.
Sure. But what about the people are going to say, then why doesn't Bassmaster do that?
We typically move north in the wintertime or in the summertime.
Skip July, it feels like.
Yeah, because ICAST and everything going on in July. We typically, we're going into August and stuff, but we're up north.
Yeah, but what about those high school tournaments?
That's another issue, and that's something that we've been struggling with. Is that's when the kids are out of school. That's when the championship tournaments for the high schools and college. Some of that is been dictated by availability of where we can go and when we can go. It's the kind of thing that if I had my way, we wouldn't have those tournaments in the middle of the summer. But there's a lot of other factors that are weighing in on when and where those events are going. And I think we are doing a lot better job of educating the kids and the boat captains. A lot of we're really working over the next several months, I hope, to get out a lot more video stuff, because kids don't read things. They're not going to go to the website and read stuff.
Yeah, they probably won't watch an information video either unless they're forced to.
Well, we're hoping to get some stuff on YouTube, some things like that eventually that we can try to get that word out a little bit better, educate the boat captains, mm-hmm. because that's where the high school kids are learning from their boat captains.
Yeah, definitely.
And then they carry it into college if they're fishing college tournaments, but they got to learn it earlier. Yeah. So,
is the penalty the same at that level? I mean, to me, that might be something as a stiffer penalty at that level where they really have a reason to learn.
Yeah. For our turn, for Bassmaster events, it's all the rules are all the same now. Yeah. What other high school or other group organizations do at the state level, I don't know. There are tournaments that have 1 pound penalties for dead fish, or there's some that don't allow the weighing of a dead fish, so there's that's kind of all over the map as to how they run their events.
Gene, we've managed to go like 45 plus minutes without saying the F word, and forward facing sonar stuff. There's no question that catch rates have increased, right? I think we all agree that catch rates have increased. I mean, I see it at my level. I mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
have those catch levels increased to the point where a guy like you, a conservation director, starts to show a little concern or starts thinking about that? And are we allowed to talk about the electronics committee?
No and yes.
Yeah.
I'm not concerned.
Okay.
If I was managing crappie fisheries, I'd be more concerned.
Okay.
But as bass fishing, like I said, the harvest of bass is so low.
Yeah, right.
Even though people may be catching more fish, they're not keeping more fish.
Right.
And it's changing, like you said, it's changing the behavior,
Yeah.
not necessarily the
You said earlier, it's such a small percentage of that chance of a catch and release. Oh, I caught that fish, throwing a spinnerbait or forward
Yeah.
fishing. So small percentage of that fish, once you release it,
Right.
it delayed
Right.
mortality effect.
And so that's and when we had our conservation summit at the Classic last month, was it last month? Yeah. That was one of the topics that we had, and I had biologists from all over the country, and that was one of the things we talked about. And it's almost uniform that from a bass fishing perspective, there's not a lot of concern with impacts on the resource. And even at the crappie, that was a lot of the studies that have been done are kind of focusing more on crappie because, or up north, it's other panfish,
Sure.
things that people harvest because they want to
Right.
eat them. Okay, so there's more concern on that side, but on the bass fishing side, it's just not that big a deal. And so, the technical committee the technology committee that
That's
Bass
what it is, yeah.
has created. My role on the committee is to look at those conservation aspects and keep tabs on what the states are doing and who's studying
et cetera,
what
yeah.
and where that's going to see if that has any influence on whatever kind of decision that our management makes. But from a bass fishing perspective, it's just not that critical right now. Nobody is seeing anything anywhere close to where it would be a problem.
Interesting.
So, a lot of there's so much misinformation on social media
Oh, yeah.
that people read things and it gets shared and shared and shared, and then it sort of becomes the truth. And there's a lot of it that's just, people are making assumptions that, oh, well, this lake has been ruined because of, forward-facing sonar. And I think a lot of it is that there's behavioral changes. There's things going on out there that we didn't really recognize before. And but from a conservation standpoint, looking at the fish populations, the state agencies a lot of them are really starting to look at it. They're incorporating things into their surveys. They're measuring, some of those kind of metrics to figure out if there is some impacts, but it's almost all related to whether it's crappie or panfish up north like bluegill or things like walleye, perch, things that are more
Tasty.
harvest oriented. And bass ain't one of them.
No, they're not on,
And so,
on the hit list.
yeah,
No, that's
from our standpoint,
It's good to hear.
so, however that whole thing, comes down through our committee from the conservation standpoint, I don't think that we're going to have a lot of play there.
Good. What else you got, Trait?
I think for the most part, that's it. You said something just a second ago. My memory is just bad. People get mad at me because I cut people off, but I have to cut them off because I don't remember. I need to do a Pingrack. You see him writing things down. I need to.
We shoot from the hip around here.
Yeah.
And speaking of, so you've been around a lot of us fishermen. I don't know if you have any, kids or grandkids. Would you ever recommend professional bass fishing to a grandkid, grandson, granddaughter as a career?
Probably not.
Why?
Well, I guess it just depends on the passion.
Yeah.
It's just like being a biologist. You don't get paid much.
Yeah. You gotta love it.
You exactly.
Yeah.
You do something. It's like one of my old professors said. Don't don't do anything that you hate just for money.
Yeah.
But he also said, yeah, you'll get your reward in heaven too. So, it's such a volatile profession that, it would, unless it's somebody that is just absolutely driven,
Mm-hmm.
It's a tough, I mean, you guys are living it. It's not an easy life.
Yeah.
And, but the people that stick with it and make a career out of it, it does kind of become a family of people out here on the road.
Yeah, you're right.
You make a lot of friends and you get to see a lot of cool places. That's from my perspective, that's one of the neat things about it is, it exposes you to a lot of different things around this country that a lot of people never get a chance to see.
That's one of the coolest parts about being a pro bass angler is seeing the St. Johns River and the back creeks way in the back where only gators live, and it truly is special. So before we let you go, we want to ask you a question here. Unless Trait, you have anything else?
Can't remember what it was. I've been sitting here this whole time you were talking. Like, what did he say? I can't remember.
Yeah, as soon as the cameras go off, it'll
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Gene, you said a lot, and we really appreciate you coming on and kind of educating everyone on fish care and how important it is, and a little bit of background and history of how that is all in place today. But before we let you go here, can you give the audience some basic life advice, some of your best life advice, whether they're an aspiring bass angler, aspiring fisheries biologist, or conservation director?
I knew that was coming because I watched your podcast. And I've tried to figure out how do I put this, but it's be true to yourself. And it kind of goes back to what I said just a minute ago. Don't do something that you don't like just for money.
Yeah.
If you're true to yourself, you will find happiness in whatever endeavors that you jump into. And it may take a while to figure it out, but if at some point you kind of find your compass,
mm-hmm.
and you can, you make a living at it, and you feel good about yourself and what you're doing, and maybe someday you make a contribution that makes a difference.
That's great. That's good advice. Stay true to yourself. That's excellent. Well, Gene, we really appreciate you. And if anyone out there has any concerns or questions regarding fish care in your local tournaments or whatever it is, feel free to reach out to Gene, right? I mean, that's what he's here for. And he does an excellent job working with BASS and all the different venues we go to. And check out some of his videos on Bassmaster.com, all the fish care videos and such. And I think his email is on the website there. We won't give it out here, but search it down on the website. And I know he would be happy to give you guys some information, or
glad to
give you some education on fish care, because this whole conversation we had here today, without conservation, we have no future in this sport. So it is utterly important to take care of your fish and take care of our resources.
And even beyond just the fish care, if people have got issues that are going on in their state or their local fishery, I may not be able to help directly, but I bet I know somebody that can.
Yeah.
And we can point them in the right direction.
Awesome. Gene Gilliland, we really appreciate you, and thank you for everything you do surrounding our sport. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me.